يا لبنان يا وطني بحبك مش مالك بذنوبك بسهلك بحبك.
I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant and question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. Today we discuss the ongoing conflict between Palestine and Israel. Sit tight. The show starts now. The world according to Jesse.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. I'm Brigida Santos. The conflict between Palestine and Israel has remained unresolved for 7 decades. It's probably one of the most complicated and partisan issues in global and U.S. domestic politics. One show, of course, could not explain all the aspects of the drama that's been unfolding in the Middle East, but we can try to shed some light on the origins of the conflict. Let's look back to the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was among the defeated. After the war, the territories previously occupied by the empire were partitioned and Palestine was placed under British control through a colonial mandate. But the conflict ensued in 1917 when Sir Arthur James Balfour promised Palestinian land to the Zionist Federation. Palestinians saw the Balfour Declaration as a European colonial project, as 90% of all Jews at the time were European. Meanwhile, the Zionist political movement saw the declaration as an answer to rising anti-Semitism. It gave them their very own national homeland, which they believed they had a legal and religious right to. Today, the conflict is still unresolved. There are still now more than 5 million registered Palestinian refugees. Jesse, we rarely hear about the Balfour Declaration and the colonial history of the conflict. What are your thoughts on the roots of this?
Well, again, it goes back to the white people of Europe and colonialism and the blowback from it. You know, we see it throughout the world, decisions made 100 years ago, 150 years ago for colonization. You know, there used to be that saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning, of course, that the white people of Britain controlled the entire world, that as the sun went around the world, it shined on something that belonged to Britain all the way around. That's the problem you have today, is today people have grown up. Today they've become more educated. Today the world has gotten a lot smaller. And the occupation and the colonialism doesn't work anymore. People want to govern themselves. They don't want to be colonial. And that's the problem. You've got the colonial hanging on to their colonies, which is much like what happened here. This was created with colonialism, and it will be defended with it the same way.
This is very much an occupation. Armed Israeli soldiers have a record of beating, detaining, killing, and torturing Palestinians. They maintain a constant military presence and control and block Palestinians' access to water, medical care, and other critical resources. Palestinians are also forced to intermittently obey curfews, and they don't enjoy the same civil rights as Israeli citizens. Jesse, what do you think about the way that Israel is treating the Palestinians?
Well, they're obviously treated like second-class people. They're obviously treated extremely bad. They're not given equal rights. And I think in today's day and age throughout the world, equal rights is one of the most important things that can happen. You're never going to justify a government unless that government gives out equal rights to its people. If it does not do that, then that government will be under some type of attack continually. That's why you see this go on and on. And the other thing, you know, I'm going to expand here a little bit and tell about a private conversation I had, Brigida. I had a private conversation with then President Bill Clinton towards the end when he was getting out. We were sitting in the library, just he and I, late at night. And he told me, this is what his crowning jewel. He wanted to get peace between Palestine and Israel. He wanted to be the one to do it, and of course he failed. He told me it's all over one big hill over there, one mountain. The Israelis believe their sacred religious stuff is there. The Palestinians believe their sacred religious stuff is there. So as long as both believe it's there and it's religion, the war is going to go on forever. Because who's ever heard of religion changing?
Supporters of Israel justify Israeli violence by accusing Palestinians of terrorism. Supporters of Palestine say Palestinian violence isn't terrorism, it's resistance against a violent colonial occupation. Israel's military is large, and it requires temporary service from all citizens over 18 years old, with some exceptions. Palestine, on the other hand, is not allowed to have a military force as terms of the Oslo Accord. However, it is allowed a paramilitary force. But due to the constant war, the Palestinian National Security Forces have been completely devastated. The vacuum has been filled by other groups like Hamas. Hamas is the democratically elected political organization that governs Gaza independently of its political rival, the Palestinian Authority. Israel and its allies list Hamas as a terrorist organization over its targeting of civilians. Jesse, most of the press that we read and see frames recent violence as a war between terrorists and Israel, but we very often witness in reality is that Israel's waging a war on Palestinians who have been confined to an open-air prison. Human Rights Watch even shows that Israeli security forces have killed and injured far more civilians than Palestinians have. Comment on why we don't hear about this in the mainstream media in their reporting on this.
I don't know. Why aren't we hearing about it? We should be hearing about it. And it seems to me this conflict is a simple one. Israel has the weapons, Palestine don't, so Israel kicks Palestine's ass whenever they feel like it, because it's not a fair fight. It's that simple. The fight is not fair. Now, they always say nothing's fair in love and war. Well, that's true. But the point is, Israel has the huge advantage. Israel has the United States backing, and Palestine has nothing. They don't even have an army, so the only thing that stands up for them are terrorist groups. What else do they have? So naturally, they call them terrorists, but I would simply call it a completely unfair war.
This summer, the Trump administration ended all funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was launched in 1949 to support 700,000 Palestinian refugees who were forced from their homes as a result of the war. Trump's decision hinges on a dispute over the definition of the word refugee. His administration says it only considers Palestinians who were alive in 1948 to be refugees, not their descendants as well. Now, this has led to a wider debate over the issue. But the refugee status of Palestinians is now just another political tool to show how much the American government sides with Israel. What do you think about this move?
Wait a minute. How can you sit and say the descendants are not refugees too? What this is them twisting words and turning things around to ultimately justify what they're doing. Let's call it like it is. Again, this is an unfair war. One side is heavily armed, the other side is not. One side has the complete advantage over the other side, and it's as simple as that. And the United States stands on the side of Israel. They always will. Actually, I kind of view Israel runs our country too, because whatever Israel wants, the U.S. gives them.
The nonviolent movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel until it ends the occupation is contentious. BDS supporters have celebrated several wins as high-profile celebrities like Lana Del Rey continue canceling scheduled appearances in Israel. To be clear, the singer never said she was participating in or supporting the movement, but her decision comes in response to increasing public pressure. People who support the BDS movement have been accused of anti-Semitism. In the U.S., 24 states have already passed laws that allow the government to punish active participants or advocates of BDS. The federal government is also trying to criminalize BDS activities, even those called upon by international bodies like the United Nations. Jesse, how can boycotting human rights abuses by Israel be considered hate against Jews? Please separate this.
You got me. I don't know. You're asking me a question, Brigida, I can't answer. I don't know. This is ridiculous. When you look at human rights violations, they apply from a group regardless of political or what they stand for. Human rights violations are human rights violations. And the United States, as the leader against human rights violations, should hang their head in shame.
The same people who say BDS efforts are anti-Semitic say nothing about Israel's new controversial law, national identity law, which undermines the rights of non-Jewish minorities. Why is there so much hypocrisy when it comes to Israel?
Well, because the people with the power rule and the people that don't have the power don't rule. It's that simple. And the people with the power can be as hypocritical as they want to be. Hypocrisy runs supreme when you got the power.
It's time for a quick break. When we return, Jessie sits down with author Alison Weir to discuss what she learned on her fact-finding mission to the region.
The world according to Jessie.
I'm Larry King, questioning, listening, learning. You know, I've always said I never learned anything when I was talking. It's important to listen. Question more.
How do we tune out the excuses and manufactured controversies?
How do we amplify the voices speaking necessary truths in these strange times?
To take on the brutal systems of privilege and power, eroding liberty and polluting our minds.
Erasing true history, sowing complacency in the face of exploitation.
Toxic bigotry, propaganda, and endless war. How? Question more.
I'm Holland Cook. I invite you to climb with me above the mainstream media mire, and from that higher vantage to glimpse the big picture. Question more.
The mainstream media, swarming with falsehoods, riddled with censorship and under corporate control, is incapable of truly informing its audience. It can't rise above the corrupt motives of those calling the shots. When you awaken to this fact, turn to RT America, where we dare to question more.
I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. My guest today is Alison Weir. She's an activist and the author of the book Against Our Better Judgement, the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel. She joins me now from San Francisco to discuss the conflict between Palestine and Israel. You know, I love this show because I really get the opportunity to get history taught to me again with things that were never discussed, even when I went back to school. We didn't discuss things like this, so you should bring the kids in to watch this show. Alison, you first traveled to Palestine territories during the Second War to independently cover the conflict. Can you first give me a brief history lesson on the conflict and where it stands today?
I'd be happy to, because as you point out, most of us don't know that. I had no idea about this 18 years ago. When I was born, it turns out, and I suspect you're about the same age, when I was born, there was no Israel. There was a region called Palestine that at that time was under the British Empire. It was largely, the conflict did not originate from the region. Some people are led to believe by media coverage and I suppose by movies, etc., that this conflict has been going on for thousands of years, people will say. It's not true. When you look back at the historic record, you see in the late 1800s, Palestine was inhabited by about 80% Muslims, about 15% Christians, that's where Christianity began after all, and about 5% Jews, without conflict. There are ancient churches there, there are ancient temples, etc. What happened is that there was a political movement that began in Europe and very quickly in the United States in the late 1800s that had the goal of pushing out those inhabitants, 95% of them, in order to create a Jewish state. They eventually succeeded in doing that. In 1948, Israel was created through a massive war that an Israeli historian has accurately called a war of ethnic cleansing. That's what this conflict is about.
Now, while you were on the ground, who did you talk to and what did you discover there?
I was there in early 2001. This is a period, it was the second major uprising by the Palestinians against the occupation and against the Israeli oppression that they were living under. So I went over there as a freelance reporter. I had known very little about the issue. I always tilted towards Israel. I had seen Exodus with Paul Newman, and I was very sympathetic to Israel. But during this uprising, I began to look into it as a journalist, and online I was very disturbed at what I thought seemed to be going on. So I traveled over there as a freelance independent reporter. I spoke to everybody I could. I traveled randomly and haphazardly throughout Gaza, throughout the West Bank, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jenin, Gaza City, Rafah, and I talked to everyone. I talked to farmers, teachers, students, professionals, people of low income, and what I saw firsthand was enormous violence against a largely unarmed population, both Christians and Muslims. I saw children who had been shot. A lot of children had been shot. You could, in hospitals in Gaza, I saw small boys who'd been shot in the chest, in the teeth, in the head. I saw a brain-dead little boy. I saw entire neighborhoods that already, this was early 2001, February and March, I saw entire neighborhoods that were destroyed. They looked to me like pictures I had seen of World War II. And it's important to remember that this was before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. This is what was going on there. It was pretty horrendous, a pretty intense trip.
Now, based on that experience of being there and the death and destruction you saw there on the ground, are American media outlets fairly covering this conflict, or are they one-sided?
The coverage is, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, very one-sided. We're getting, at minimum, Israel-centric reporting in terms of what they put in and what they leave out, especially what they leave out, and the spin that we get. And I'm talking about both the liberal media and the conservative media. We are getting reporting that has Israel spin in it. We've done a number of studies, statistical studies on coverage. My son is a scientist. I like to learn factual information. So we looked into how media had covered deaths among both populations, clearly an important category and a quantifiable category. And we found, for example, that primetime network news, CBS, NBC, ABC, were reporting on Israeli children's deaths at rates 13 and 14 times greater than they were reporting on Palestinian children's deaths. In other words, when a Palestinian child is killed, which is happening fairly frequently over the past 20 years, this is quite common. The media almost never report on it. It's just not considered newsworthy, I suppose. When an Israeli child is tragically killed, that's headlines. We hear about that. So Americans are getting very filtered coverage, very filtered coverage. We always hear about the rockets from Gaza.
Now,
we never hear that the rockets came after the violence against people in Gaza.
Yeah, we sure didn't. Anyway, you started an organization called If Americans Knew. What do you want Americans to know about Palestine and Israel, and what aren't they being told about them?
Well, I think one thing that I think it's essential that we learn is that we as Americans are very much a part of this conflict. I always thought it was Israel-Palestine and had really nothing to do with me. I think many people think that. I don't happen to be Jewish, and I didn't think I had any connection to this conflict. Most of us feel that way, I suspect. But in reality, the U.S., our politicians from both parties, are giving Israel massive amounts of money, over $10 million per day. We have given Israel, tiny Israel, far more of our tax money than anywhere else. This makes us responsible for what Israel does. And the rest of the world knows that. especially in the Middle East, but other parts of the world too, are quite aware that Americans are funding Israeli actions. And they are often also very aware that Israeli actions are quite often violent. They have violated human rights. This is well documented, violated international law, even violated U.S. laws. So I think it's very important for us to know that we're part of this issue, and therefore we need to learn independently the real facts about Israel-Palestine. And we're not getting that from our mainstream media, neither from the liberal nor from the conservative media.
Now, your book is about how the U.S. was used to create Israel. Can you explain the roots of the alliance and that creation?
I'll be happy to. The first thing I want to note is it's not really an alliance. An alliance means that both parties benefit in some manner, that there's some sort of two-way street here. But really, it's Israel that benefits. They get U.S. money, massive amounts of money. They get U.S. weaponry. They get wonderful trade agreements and preferential treatment. They get cover in the international community by the U.S. They've gotten some wars. We invaded Iraq largely for Israel. So they've gotten a great deal from the U.S. We've gotten very little. We get hostility. We lose money from our economy. Often there are subsidies to Israel that hurt that cause job loss in the United States. So it's not really what you would call an alliance. But it was forged early on by a very powerful and very pervasive lobby on behalf of Israel, pushing this in the American society, using various types of efforts to create this situation in which the U.S. government would support Israel no matter what Israel does, and that most of the American population would be unaware of any of this.
And this is all the result of the powerful Israel lobby to our congressmen and our senators, correct? They spend a great deal of money lobbying our elected officials, correct?
That's correct. That's exactly what's been going on for many decades. I should point out that at the beginning, when this lobby became active, before to create Israel, our experts in the State Department, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence agencies back, decades ago under Truman and before, were recommending against supporting Israel because it would be detrimental to the United States. There were numerous studies and memos and reports all saying that this would be bad for the U.S. These were coming out of the Pentagon, the State Department, etc. But what we had then and what we have now are individuals and groups that organize huge campaign donations to our politicians from both parties that they will give to those politicians if they toe the line on Israel. And if they don't toe the line, then that money will go to their opponents. This is widely known in Washington, D.C. This is how it works. This is what's going on right now. When you look into it, it's quite blatant. There are numerous political action committees with somewhat deceptive names that give money to Israel, and billionaires like Haim Saban and Sheldon Adelson that are giving to our candidates on condition that the candidates support Israel, no matter what Israel does.
It goes to show you that the system of bribery is so alive and well that the Democrats and Republicans have created. Now, how does America's cozy relationship with Israel affect the geopolitics in the Middle East? What happens because of this?
It's disastrous. It's a tragic result. We've seen numerous wars. We've seen Iraq destroyed. Then that has destabilized. Then the refugees have gone to Syria. It's caused the rise of extremism, of violence throughout the region. It's destabilizing entire countries. Then we have a refugee crisis in which refugees are fleeing the violence and going to Europe, causing disruption in Europe and elsewhere, all very much rooted in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And this is not unintended. I've been studying this now for 18 years. And Israel, from its earliest days, Ben-Gurion in the 1950s, was writing about their strategy. After all, they had dispossessed an entire population in the middle of the Middle East. So their strategy was they had to prevent any of the surrounding countries that naturally would support the rights of the refugees to return home. They had to prevent any of those surrounding countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, other countries, from becoming successful enough to challenge Israel. So they either push through policies in the U.S. in which our tax money would be used to buy off Egypt and Jordan, and that's what was done. They both get lots of U.S. tax money too. And in other cases, they've helped create wars and violence in places like Lebanon. They've invaded Lebanon at least twice, 2 major invasions, other smaller ones. They now have the U.S., our hostility towards Iran is very much being pushed by Israel and the Israel lobby. It's created instability and tragic in the Middle East, and that is dangerous for the entire world.
Alison, I hate to stop us, but we'll run out of time. I want to thank you very much, very, very much, for this phenomenal history lesson on the world according to Jesse. Thank you. The world according to Jesse.
Let's turn to the viewers. We asked people on social media, what message does moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem send to Israel, Palestine, and the international community? Is this a smart decision? Why or why not? Charles says it's largely symbolic gesture that will likely have negative international consequences. While I'm sure it pleased the Kushner bloc, it's a waste of time and capital that will do nothing for the stability of the region. Jesse?
Well, I agree with him. In fact, I think it destabilizes the region. If they'd have left it where it was, no one would be protesting over anything, but they chose to move it, which helped to ramp up dissension and get the ball rolling and light the fire.
Daria says the same message we've been sending. We have no integrity or consistency when it comes to human rights or international law. We and our allies do what we wish, and we always get a pass.
And he's absolutely correct on that. The United States never looks at itself for human rights violations. They never look at our allies for human rights violations. But boy, we're quick to go to war when somebody else does it, like maybe Syria. Oh, we'll pump rockets into no end if Syria does it. But if anybody else does it who's a friend of ours, gee, we happen to look the other way.
Thanks for watching. Send us your comments on Facebook and Twitter for a chance to be featured in next week's episode when we investigate the exploitation of college athletes.
And remember, when the government lies, the truth becomes a traitor. Stay vigilant, people. I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse.
بحبك يا لبنان يا وطني بحبك بشمالك بجنوبك بسهلك بحبك